For 6 months, the janitor came in at 2 a.m. Every single night, he did the same thing. Nobody knew. Nobody asked. The cameras were installed to catch theft, to monitor supply waste, to prove that the overnight cleaning crew was actually doing their jobs. St. Michael's Regional Hospital had failed its last compliance audit, and the director needed evidence that protocols were being followed. So the cameras went up, 3 corners of the emergency room, silent, blinking, recording everything. Paul Hendricks didn't watch the footage for 2 weeks. There was no reason to. He was the hospital director, 51 years old, drowning in budgets and staffing shortages and insurance disputes. He lived 3 floors up in an office that smelled like coffee and printer toner, far from the blood and the beeping and the desperate hours when people showed up not knowing if they'd leave alive. He knew spreadsheets. He knew risk management. He knew how to write memos that sounded concerned without actually changing anything. But the night shift supervisor kept mentioning something strange in her reports. Not a problem exactly, just something she couldn't explain. Supplies were lasting longer than they should. Patients in the overnight ER were calmer, fewer call button requests, fewer complaints. The charge nurse said the same thing. It was subtle, easy to miss, but it was there. So Paul finally opened the video files. He started with Thursday night, September 23rd, 11 p.m. The ER had that exhausted hum it always had after the dinner rush of heart attacks and car accidents. A man with a gash on his forearm sat in Bay 2, scrolling his phone while waiting for stitches. An elderly woman in Bay 5 stared at the ceiling, alone. A teenager in Bay 7 had his mother next to him, her hand on his shoulder, both of them looking afraid. The staff moved through their routines. A nurse checked vitals. A doctor signed a chart. Someone restocked gloves in the supply room. And then just after 2 in the morning, the janitor came in. Paul almost didn't notice him. The man was in his 70s, maybe older, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone whose body had been used hard for too many years. He wore the grey uniform all the cleaning staff wore, a name stitched in red thread over the pocket that Paul couldn't quite read from this angle. He pushed a yellow cart with a mop bucket, a spray bottle, a stack of folded towels. Nothing unusual. Paul had seen him before in passing, the way you see people whose work is designed to be invisible. The janitor stopped at the nurse's station and began wiping down the counter. Standard procedure. Paul was about to fast forward when the man paused, set down his cloth, and looked toward Bay 5. The elderly woman was still there. Still alone. Still staring at the ceiling. The janitor walked over. Paul leaned forward. The woman didn't seem to notice him at first. Her hands were folded on top of the thin hospital blanket, fingers laced together like she was praying or just holding on to herself. The janitor stood at the foot of her bed for a moment, not speaking, just watching. Then he moved closer and said something Paul couldn't hear. The woman turned her head. Her expression didn't change, but she looked at him, and the janitor smiled. He reached into his cart and pulled out one of the folded towels, a white one, still warm from the dryer in the basement. He walked to the side of her bed and gently placed it over her hands. The woman closed her eyes. The janitor waited, not long, maybe 30 seconds. Then he adjusted the towel slightly, nodded to himself, and went back to his cart. He continued cleaning. Paul replayed the moment 3 times. It wasn't part of the man's job. There was no policy that said janitors should cover patients' hands with warm towels. It wasn't in any training manual. It wasn't billable. It wasn't even something most people would think to do. But he did it. Before we continue, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. I believe this story found you today for a reason. Paul opened the next night's footage, Friday, September 24th, same time, 2 in the morning. The janitor came in again, same cart, same careful movements. This time there was a man in bay 3, middle-aged, sitting upright in bed with his arms crossed. He looked angry, or maybe just scared in the way that comes out as anger. The nurse had been in twice already, checking his IV, asking questions he didn't answer. The janitor cleaned the area near the man's bed, emptied the small trash bin, wiped down the metal tray table. Then he paused, looked at the man, and said something. The man glanced at him, shook his head, looked away. The janitor nodded, didn't push, and continued his work. But as he moved to leave, he stopped and set a small cup of water on the tray table, within reach. The man didn't say anything, but after the janitor left, he picked up the cup and drank. Paul checked Saturday night, then Sunday, then the entire week, every night the same thing. The janitor came in at 2 in the morning and cleaned the ER the way he was supposed to. But in between wiping counters and mopping floors, he did other things, small things, things no one had asked him to do. He adjusted pillows for patients who couldn't reach the call button. He refilled water cups without being asked. He moved chairs closer to bedsides so family members didn't have to stand. He turned off overhead lights for people who were trying to sleep. He brought warm towels from his cart and placed them gently over the hands of elderly patients who lay alone in the cold, fluorescent silence of the overnight ER. And he did it every single night for 6 months without telling anyone. Paul sat in his office with the footage paused on the screen, the janitor frozen mid-step, carrying a towel toward a woman in bay 4. The red time stamp in the corner read 2:17 a.m. The rest of the ER was empty except for one nurse at the far desk, head down, filling out paperwork. She had no idea what was happening 15 feet away. Paul opened the employee directory and searched for the name he'd finally been able to read from a closer camera angle. James Wiley, 73 years old, hired 11 years ago, position, environmental services technician, overnight shift, 5 nights a week, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. No disciplinary notes, no complaints, no commendations either. Just a name in a database, a ID badge number, a paycheck deposited every 2 weeks. Paul printed out the last 6 months of footage logs and started going through them methodically. He noted the times James entered the ER, the length of time he spent in each bay, the small actions he took that weren't part of his job description. He made a list. It was long, longer than he expected. He called the night shift supervisor, a woman named Karen who'd worked at St. Michael's for 19 years. She answered on the second ring, her voice tired but alert. "Karen, do you know James Wiley?" There was a pause. "The janitor?" "Yes. I mean, I see him around. He's quiet, does his job. Why? Have you ever seen him interact with patients?" Another pause, longer this time. "I don't think so. I mean, maybe. I'm usually at the desk. Why is there a problem?" Paul didn't know how to answer that. No problem, thanks." He hung up and stared at the screen again. The problem wasn't that James was doing something wrong. The problem was that he was doing something extraordinary and no one had noticed. Paul checked the schedules. James worked Sunday through Thursday, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. It was currently Tuesday, just after 4 in the afternoon. James would be arriving at the hospital in 6 hours. Paul made a decision. He would go down to the ER tonight. He would watch, not on a screen this time, in person. At 11:30 that night, Paul stood in the hallway outside the emergency room, wearing street clothes instead of his usual suit, holding a cup of coffee he didn't want. The ER was busy. A man with chest pain in Bay 1, a child with a fever in Bay 6, a woman who'd fallen and couldn't put weight on her ankle in Bay 8. The nurses moved between them with the practiced efficiency of people who'd seen it all before. The doctors spoke in low voices, checking charts, ordering tests, making decisions that would save lives or just delay the inevitable. James arrived at 10 minutes past midnight. Paul watched him clock in at the staff entrance, exchange a brief nod with the security guard, and push his cart toward the ER. He moved slowly, but not because he was lazy. It was the kind of slowness that comes from pain managed quietly, from joints that ache in the cold, from a body that's been asked to work long past the age when most people retire. Paul followed at a distance. James started in the usual way. He wiped down the nurse's station, emptied the small trash bins, refilled the paper towel dispensers. No one spoke to him. No one looked up. He was part of the landscape, invisible in the way that people who clean up after others always are. And then, just after 1 in the morning, James walked over to Bay 3. There was a woman there, maybe in her 80s, lying on her side, facing the wall. Her daughter had been with her earlier, but had gone home to sleep, promising to return in the morning. The woman hadn't moved in over an hour. The nurse had checked on her twice, adjusted her IV, made sure she was stable. But stable wasn't the same as comfortable. It wasn't the same as not alone. James stood at the foot of the bed, just like he did in the footage. He waited. Then he moved closer and spoke, his voice so quiet Paul almost couldn't hear it. "Ma'am, are you cold?" The woman didn't respond at first. Then, slowly, she turned her head. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused. "Yes," she whispered. James nodded. He walked back to his cart and pulled out a towel, white and neatly folded. He placed it in the microwave in the staff break room, the one the nurses used to heat up their lunches. He waited 2 minutes, tested the towel with his hand, then brought it back. He draped it gently over the woman's shoulders. She closed her eyes. "Thank you," she said, so softly Paul barely heard it. James adjusted the towel, made sure it wouldn't slip, and went back to his cart. He didn't say anything else. He just continued cleaning. Paul stood in the hallway, his coffee cold in his hand, and felt something crack open in his chest. He'd spent 15 years in hospital administration. He'd overseen budgets in the millions. He'd hired and fired, restructured departments, implemented new protocols. He'd done everything he was supposed to do to make the hospital run efficiently. But he'd never once thought to bring someone a warm towel. Paul went back to his office and didn't sleep. He spent the rest of the night reviewing everything he could find about James Wiley, employment records, background check, references from the staffing agency that had placed him 11 years ago. There wasn't much. James had worked in hospitals before, mostly in maintenance and environmental services. He'd been a custodian at a nursing home in Ohio for 12 years. Before that, he'd been in the Army, medic, 2 tours in Vietnam, honorable discharge. After that, the record went quiet for a long time. No employment history, no address, just a gap of nearly 15 years. Paul found a phone number listed under emergency contact, a woman named Marie Wiley. He hesitated, then dialed. She answered on the 4th ring. "Hello? Hi, is this Marie Wiley?" "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Paul Hendricks. I'm the director at St. Michael's Regional Hospital. James Wiley works here, and I wanted to ask you a few questions if you have a minute." There was a long silence. Then "Is he okay? Did something happen?" No, he's fine. I'm calling because I've been reviewing some of our overnight operations, and I noticed James has been going above and beyond in his role. I wanted to learn more about him." Another silence. "Above and beyond," she repeated, her voice strange. "That sounds like James." "Are you his wife?" "I was. We divorced about 20 years ago, but we stayed in touch. He doesn't have anyone else." "Can I ask you something? Why does he work overnight? At 73, most people would have retired by now. Marie laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. You'd have to ask him that, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's because he can't stop. He's been taking care of people his whole life. That's what he did in the war. That's what he did after. And when things fell apart for him, when he lost everything, the only thing he knew how to do was keep taking care of people. What do you mean, lost everything? Marie hesitated. Our son died. He was 19, car accident. James was never the same. After that, he stopped talking, stopped sleeping, started drinking. I tried to help, but he wouldn't let me. Eventually, I had to leave. I couldn't watch him destroy himself. He was homeless for a while. I didn't know where he was for almost 10 years. Then one day he called me, told me he'd gotten clean, found a job, said he was okay. I didn't believe him at first, but he kept calling every few months just to let me know he was still alive. Paul didn't know what to say. He doesn't talk about our son, Marie continued. Not to me, not to anyone. But I think he's still trying to save him every single day. That's why he works with people who are suffering. That's why he can't stop. Paul thanked her and hung up. He sat in his office as the sun came up, the city waking outside his window, and tried to imagine what it would be like to carry that kind of grief. To lose a child and spend the rest of your life trying to make up for it by caring for strangers in the middle of the night. To do it quietly, without recognition, without thanks, just because it was the only thing that made sense anymore. He thought about all the policies he'd written, all the efficiency metrics he'd tracked, all the ways he'd tried to make the hospital run like a business instead of a place where people came to be saved. And he realized he'd been measuring the wrong things. Paul called an emergency meeting with the senior staff the next morning. The chief of medicine, the head of nursing, the HR director, the night shift supervisor. He brought his laptop and pulled up the footage. I need you to watch something, he said. He played the clips, the warm towels, the water cups, the adjusted pillows, the quiet moments of care that happened in the spaces between policies and procedures. No one spoke. When the footage ended, the room stayed silent. Finally, the head of nursing, a woman named Patricia who'd worked at St. Michael's for 30 years, said, "How long has he been doing this?" 6 months that I can confirm. Probably longer. And no one knew. No one knew. Patricia shook her head slowly. We're supposed to be the ones taking care of patients. That's our job. And we missed this completely. The chief of medicine, a man named Dr. Raymond Kutcher, leaned back in his chair. It's not that we missed it, it's that we're not designed to see it. We're measuring wait times and readmission rates and patient satisfaction scores. We're not measuring whether someone brought a warm towel to an elderly woman at 2 in the morning. Maybe we should be, Paul said. The HR director frowned. What are you proposing? Paul didn't have a full answer yet, but he knew what he didn't want. He didn't want to call James into his office and thank him in front of cameras. He didn't want to give him an award at a staff meeting. He didn't want to turn his quiet acts of care into a publicity stunt. I want to know why he's doing this, Paul said, and I want to know how we can support it. They decided to approach James carefully. No confrontation, no spotlight, just a conversation. Paul found him 3 nights later, just after his shift ended. James was sitting in the staff break room, eating a sandwich he'd brought from home, his grey uniform spotted with cleaning solution. He looked up when Paul walked in, surprised, but not alarmed. "Mr. Wiley, do you have a minute?" James set down his sandwich. "Am I in trouble?" "No, not at all. I just wanted to talk to you about something I noticed." James didn't say anything, but his expression changed. Guarded now, careful. Paul sat down across from him. I've been reviewing footage from the ER, the cameras we installed a few months ago, and I saw what you've been doing. James looked down at his hands. I'm still cleaning. I'm doing my job. I know, but you're doing more than that. You're taking care of patients in ways that aren't part of your job description. I'm not trying to step on anyone's toes. If the nurses want me to stop. No, Paul interrupted. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that what you're doing is remarkable, and I want to understand why. James was quiet for a long time. Then he said, because no one else is. What do you mean? I mean, the nurses are busy. The doctors are busy. Everyone's doing their job and they're doing it well. But there are things that fall through the cracks. Small things. A patient who's cold. A patient who's thirsty. A patient who just needs someone to notice they're there. Those things don't get charted. They don't get billed. So they don't get done. So you do them. Someone has to. Paul thought about what Marie had told him, about the sun, about the grief. He wanted to ask, but it didn't feel right. Instead, he said, how long have you been doing this? James shrugged. Since I started here, maybe before. I don't really think about it anymore. It's just what I do. Did anyone ever teach you when you were a medic? James looked up sharply. How did you know I was a medic? I looked at your file. James nodded slowly. Yeah, that's where I learned it. You take care of people. That's the job. Doesn't matter if you're a doctor or a janitor. If someone needs help and you can give it, you give it. Paul felt that crack in his chest widen. Mr. Wiley, I want to ask you something. And I need you to be honest. Are you okay? Financially, I mean. Are you working this job because you have to or because you want to? James hesitated. Both, I guess. I need the money, but I also need the work. Does that make sense? It does. I don't have much else. No family, no hobbies. This is what I do. And it helps. Helping people helps. Paul understood then. This wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about gratitude. It was about survival. James was using care the way some people use medicine, to numb the pain, to make the days bearable, to find meaning in a life that had been emptied out by loss. And Paul realized that if he tried to change it, if he tried to formalize it or reward it or turn it into something official, he might break the very thing that made it work. So he made a different decision. I'm going to do something, Paul said, but I need your permission first. I want to create a new position, not a janitor, not a nurse, something in between. Someone whose job is to notice the small things, to take care of patients in the ways that don't fit into anyone else's job description. And I want you to be the first person in that role. James stared at him. I don't understand. You'd still clean, but you'd also have time set aside specifically to check on patients, to bring them warm towels, to refill their water, to sit with them if they're alone. We'd train other staff to do it too eventually, but you'd be the one who teaches them because you already know how. I don't know if I'm qualified. You're the most qualified person in this building. James looked down at his hands again. They were old, hands scarred and rough, the hands of someone who'd spent a lifetime working. What would you call the position? Paul hadn't thought about that. He considered for a moment. Patient care liaison, or comfort specialist, or maybe just care coordinator. I don't know yet. What would you want it to be called? James smiled for the first time. It was a small smile, sad around the edges. I don't care what you call it, as long as I can keep doing the work. You can, I promise. They shook hands. James's grip was strong despite his age. When he left the break room, Paul sat alone in the fluorescent silence and thought about all the ways institutions fail people, not through cruelty, not through neglect, but through blindness, through the assumption that if something isn't measured, it doesn't matter, through the belief that efficiency is the same as care. He thought about how close they'd come to never knowing, how James could have worked there for another 10 years, doing his quiet work, and retired without anyone ever noticing. How many other people were doing the same thing, invisible in their care, unseen in their grace? Paul spent the next 3 weeks building the program. He worked with HR to create the new position. He worked with the finance department to find room in the budget. He worked with the nursing staff to figure out how the role would integrate with existing care protocols. It wasn't easy. There were questions, concerns. Some people thought it was unnecessary, others thought it was a waste of resources, but Paul pushed forward because he'd seen the footage. He'd seen what happened when someone cared in the ways that couldn't be quantified, and he knew it mattered. The program launched in November. James became the hospital's first official patient comfort coordinator. His salary increased. His hours were adjusted so he wasn't working overnight every single night. He was given a new uniform, not grey, but a soft blue, with his name and title embroidered on the pocket. And he was given a small budget to purchase the things patients needed most: warm blankets, extra pillows, lip balm, hand lotion, the tiny comforts that hospitals often forget. But here's what you need to know. Here's what makes this story different from most. James didn't want a ceremony. He didn't want his picture in the hospital newsletter. When Paul suggested recognizing him at the annual staff meeting, James declined. "I don't need that," he said. "I just need to do the work." So there was no applause, no viral moment, no news cameras, just a man who kept doing what he'd always done, except now he was allowed to do it without hiding. And slowly, others noticed. A nurse named Angela started bringing warm towels to her patients during overnight shifts. A young doctor named Kevin started sitting with elderly patients who were waiting alone for test results. The security guard, a man named Marcus, started checking on people in the waiting room who looked afraid. It spread quietly, the way goodness often does, not through mandates, not through policies, but through example. Paul kept the cameras running, not to monitor James, but to see what else he'd been missing. And what he found surprised him. There were dozens of small acts of care happening every day, invisible unless you knew to look. A housekeeper who always made sure the flowers in patient rooms had fresh water. A cafeteria worker who saved extra desserts for the night shift nurses. A transporter who took the long route when moving elderly patients so they could see the windows. The hospital was full of people like James, people who cared more than their job descriptions required, people who understood that healing wasn't just about medicine. But if you're wondering whether this story has a perfect ending, it doesn't. James still worked too much. He still carried grief that no promotion could heal. He still went home to an empty apartment where the photos on the wall were of a son who would never grow old. The work helped, but it didn't fix him. Maybe nothing could. And the hospital didn't transform overnight. There were still long wait times, still insurance denials, still moments when the system failed people in ways large and small. One man with a warm towel couldn't change that, but something did change: the way the staff saw their work, the way patients felt when they walked through the doors, the understanding that care wasn't just a protocol, it was a choice, made every day, in 1,000 small ways, by people whose names most patients would never know. 6 months after the program launched, Paul was reviewing patient feedback forms. Most were routine, comments about wait times, about the food, about the noise. But one stood out. It was from a woman named Dorothy Chen, 81 years old, who'd spent 3 nights in the ER after a fall. "I don't remember the name of the doctor who treated me," she wrote. "I don't remember most of the nurses, but I remember the man who brought me a warm towel when I was cold. I remember that he asked if I needed anything. I remember that he didn't rush. I was so scared. and he made me feel like I mattered. I don't know if he'll ever read this, but please, tell him thank you. Please tell him he saved me in a way that had nothing to do with medicine." Paul printed the comment and brought it to James during his next shift. James read it slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he folded the paper and put it in his pocket. "Does this mean something to you?" Paul asked. James nodded. "It means I'm still here, and so is she. That's enough." Paul wanted to say more. He wanted to tell James that he was extraordinary, that what he did mattered more than anything Paul had accomplished in 15 years of administration. But he knew James wouldn't want to hear it. So instead, he just said thank you. James went back to work. Paul returned to his office. The hospital continued. Life continued. The cameras kept recording, silent and patient, capturing moments that most people would never see. And somewhere in the middle of the night, in the fluorescent quiet of the emergency room, a 73-year-old man with scarred hands and a careful walk brought a warm towel to a stranger who was cold and afraid. He didn't do it for recognition. He didn't do it for a promotion. He did it because someone had to, because small acts of care, repeated endlessly, are what hold the world together when everything else falls apart. That's the story. That's what the camera saw. Not a miracle, not a dramatic rescue. Just a man who remembered that healing begins with being seen, with being treated like you matter, with someone noticing that you're cold and doing something about it. It's easy to miss. It doesn't show up on any chart. It doesn't get billed to insurance. It doesn't make headlines, but it changes everything. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been in a hospital and had someone show you unexpected kindness? Maybe it was a janitor, maybe it was a nurse, maybe it was someone whose job had nothing to do with your care but who saw you anyway. Tell me about it in the comments. These stories matter, these people matter, and I think more of us need to hear them.